I'd like to welcome you all to the CASE CSA webinar series organized by the Canadian Association of Sociology of Education and the Canadian Sociological Association. It's my pleasure to moderate the session today. My name is Jeannie Kerr, and I'm a second-generation settler and associate professor at the University of Manitoba. I'm joining you today from the traditional and ancestral territories of the Anishinaabe, Nahiawak, Anisinaawak, Dakota Oyate and Dene peoples and home of the Red River Métis on Treaty 1 territory. So while we're meeting today on a virtual platform in Canada, we're mostly located on lands that are marked by disregarded treaties and have been dispossessed from Indigenous peoples. And we would collectively encourage you to take a moment to recognize the land that you're on and consider your responsibilities to the land and the knowledge holders. And we invite you to learn more about the territory where you reside at nativeland.ca. So we encourage you to engage in today's conversation. Access to closed captioning is available. Please put your questions in the chat and we'll engage with the questions after the presentation. Just note that your name and your question will be visible to all attendees. You can also choose to upvote questions to push them higher up the list. So today, a great pleasure to engage with today's presentation, Aspirational Indigenization, an analysis of Canadian University Institutional Strategic Plans and Indigenous Strategic Plans. Our presenters today are Dr. Adam Gaudry, who serves as Vice Dean and Associate Professor in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. He is a citizen of the Manitoba Métis Federation. His family is Red River Métis from Lake of the Woods in northwestern Ontario, migrated there from southern Manitoba. He has published extensively on Métis history and governance, Indigenous research methodologies, as well as Indigenization policy in Canadian higher education. Also with us is Dr. Rob Hancock. He is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Victoria. He is Cree Métis on his mother's side and English Canadian on his father's. He's trained as an historian of anthropology, and Rob's research and teaching interests fall in two related areas, the first being the relationships between Indigenous peoples and the state, and the second being representations of Indigenous people in the social sciences, primarily within anthropology. And also Danielle Lorenz, a PhD candidate in the social justice and international studies and education specialization within the educational policy studies program at the University of Alberta. Danielle's dissertation research examines the always already existence of white settler colonialism within Alberta's education systems. Other interests include the likelihood of decolonization in higher education and K-12 systems of education, pervasive nature of whiteness, autoethnography, syndactyly, and critical disability studies. So it's my pleasure to bring these great scholars to you for their presentation.
All right, so can everyone see the slides okay? Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, we're very excited to be here. Yeah, so I think we'll just move through the slideshow. Rob will take it away, and then we'll get started.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, everybody, for being here, and thanks, Jeannie, for the introductions. I'll just check in with Adam and Danielle and see if there's anything you wanted to add to that, to the introductions. I'll just mention that I also have an admin role. I'm the Associate Director Academic in the Office of Indigenous Academic and Community Engagement at UVic. So my work crosses academics and student affairs. And so that's, I think, a part of the context for the work that Adam and I have been doing for many years, and more recently with Danielle. Can you move on to the acknowledgements slide, please? So the project we're working on is supported by a SSHRC Insight Development Grant. We're just coming to the end of year 2 of that. So this is an opportunity for to share some of the work in progress, and also benefited from some seed funding from the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Victoria that helped us write the grant that is enabling us to do this work.
Awesome. Yeah. So, if it isn't already clear, we're going to be presenting collectively today rather than having three individual presentations. This is work we've been doing together for some time now, and this is something we wanted to share at kind of some of our preliminary results with you. So we'll be kind of exploring the breadth and depth of our project today. So, the structure of our presentation, we're going to start with some background and context. We'll lay out our framework, which is based on some of the work Danielle and I have done previously. We'll be talking about our methodology for analyzing strategic plans. And we'll talk a little bit about our findings as well, some of our early findings, and discuss their implications. We have time at the end for some Q&A and some discussion. And I was taking a look at the guest list, and given some of the really senior scholars, the people who've been doing this for a long time, I'm really looking forward to that discussion in particular. So to begin a little bit, I want to acknowledge, of course, indigenization is not something that started with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its final report. This is something that has been going on for a long time. People have been laboring on this for years, and the TRC was really the tipping point for this kind of emerging into public consciousness. And if you've been around Indigenous studies as long as the three of us have, and many in the webinar today, you'll remember, of course, a time when we were doing this, and it wasn't getting a lot of attention. So we want to talk a little bit about what we see as like a kind of major turning point where it shifted from something that was being done on a small scale to something that universities and colleges were starting to think about in a more systematic way. And one of the kind of big shifts for that was the Build and Reconciliation Forum. The first one happened at the University of Saskatchewan in 2015. This was immediately following the release of the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And this was, I think, a fairly transformative moment. I was still a very junior scholar back then, and I was on the organizing committee. And my experience with Indigenous studies was like it was a great space, but they were always kind of small spaces at universities with like a very committed, but at the end of the day, quite a small group of people. And I remember watching the guest list for the people that had RSVP to this thing just grow and grow and grow. And I was like, what is going on? And they kept a separate tally for the presidents of all the different post-secondary institutions in Canada that had basically signed up to come to this. And I was just like, this is really interesting. I didn't ever expect to see this sort of thing. And I think that this is like in many ways a good thing, because I think the building reconciliation forums that happened over the years was really kind of important in building this sort of consensus that reconciliation and indigenization should be a central part of Canada's post-secondary institutions. However, despite this kind of broad uptake of indigenization, or at least the rhetoric around indigenization, there's been kind of subsequently very little um, consensus on how we proceed together, what this looks like in practice, and how do we implement it effectively. Um, and this is kind of the genesis. This is the starting point for our project: is how do we get to from the strategic plan, the kind of big strategic goals, to the actual practice of indigenization that's meaningful for Indigenous peoples uh, on campus and in community. So a little bit about our project background, kind of defining some of our key terms. So indigenization, we have kind of two definitions that we work with. One is kind of a generalist definition, which is here on the screen, and we take that from Call et al. And Rob was involved in this publication as well. So we define indigenization as a collaborative process of naturalizing Indigenous intent, interactions, and processes, and making them evident to transform spaces, places, and hearts through including Indigenous perspectives and approaches in post-secondary uh, settings. We also acknowledge, and this is coming from the work of Danielle and me, um, that indigenization is a contested term. It's used lots of different ways, and there's kind of a way in which Some people have very kind of ambitious, structural, transformative change in mind when they talk about indigenization, and others might have a kind of more, you know, like inclusion-based EDI focus to indigenization. And these ideas are kind of contested, and we still kind of see that, and coming from our kind of earlier work. That Danielle and I kind of did analyzing the language around indigenization, that there's this kind of a difference in intent, and a difference in long-term vision. And so we also want to kind of acknowledge the ways in which um, indigenization remains a term with many meanings. Um, so building from this point, we wanted to start this project by using this kind of contested understanding of indigenization, and conduct a Canada-wide analysis of how indigenization is envisioned by Canadian universities and how that's articulated through their strategic documents. We examined two types of strategic plans. The first were the institutional strategic plans, so the big ones that cover the whole university. But we also looked at Indigenous strategic plans, which are an increasingly common strategic document that focuses on indigenization and reconciliation in kind of post-secondary settings in Canada. A lot of institutions have these, although not all. And so we found this as a particularly rich document for analysis. We initially considered including EDI plans as well. And all of us, of course, are definitely in favor of EDI. But there are many differences with EDI, and we found that they're not always kind of compatible. It's kind of like a concentric circle type thing where there is some overlap, but enough of the indigenization approach is different that we wanted to focus on that in particular. So emerging from this, we have three kind of overarching goals for our project. So the first is to document and analyze the current state of indigenization as it is understood, as it's envisioned and practiced at Canadian universities. The second is we want to be able to, from this, propose ways to improve both the implementation and the impact of indigenization initiatives at universities. And third, we want to produce professional development materials for institutional leaders that allow them to kind of take what we've found and implement it in more meaningful and structurally transformative ways at their home institutions. And we've built this project around three data collection points. So the first, we have completed a pilot study which initially looked at Indigenous and university strategic plans for the anglophone U15 universities. This was a proof of concept. We have since moved on to kind of expand this pilot study to cover the 45 institutions listed in the Maclean's rankings, and which we'll be talking about a little bit at the end. We also want to interview university leaders and those leading indigenization kind of on the ground to talk really about how this planning takes place, whose ideas win out, and the kind of contest around them. So I will turn it over to Rob to kind of situate us in the literature a little bit more.
So there's a tremendous amount of literature to draw upon. We recognized, and this is just three examples, and I realized I made a typo in the third citation. It should actually be Tam Tipking Gunter 2019. There's a tremendous amount of work already done on experiences and expectations of Indigenous students, on Indigenous faculty, and the experiences of Indigenous leaders more recently. And these are just sort of top of mind citations. There was no way that we were going to be able to do a comprehensive literature review of all of these aspects. But this is to illustrate the work that we did to recognize that while there's been work on the experience of Indigenous people at various phases of their time in the university, that there had been an incredible amount of work on curriculum and pedagogy in post-secondary settings, including from folks whose names I see in the chat, and work on disciplinary responses to the TRC calls to action, not just in education, post-secondary education, but as Adam and Danielle have tracked elsewhere, from engineering to child and youth care to across the Canadian post-secondary world, there have been responses to the TRC specific to disciplines, And then we also found emerging work on equity plans and strategies, such as Tamtek and Gunter's work. But we have yet to find anything specifically on Indigenous strategic documents, and that could be explained for a couple of reasons. One, it could be that they're relatively new in the Canadian context, although UBC has had ones going back to the 2000s, just to pick one example of a long-standing one. But also, I think another aspect that we've talked about is that the folks who would be analyzing these are also the people already doing the work. And so that there is an issue of focus and capacity where people are place more emphasis on doing the work of indigenization than the sort of meta-analysis of thinking about how they're thinking about indigenization.
Yeah. Thanks, Rob. So why are we focusing on strategic plans? Because these are, at the end of the day, quite imperfect documents. But they are important as well, because strategic plans, for all of their faults, are really the only kind of document that generally um, allows us to understand like what the closest thing to a university-wide consensus is on particular issues and priorities. They are largely developed through a collective process. It's not an equal process by any means, but it is a process in which everyone at least is invited to be involved. And it does kind of produce somewhat of an institutional consensus on priorities. Many institutions also produce very similar types of strategic documents. Going through these, there is a lot of plans. I once created a strategic plan using ChatGPT, and it sounded surprisingly convincing. Like there is somewhat of a uniformity here, but there are also important differences. And this, like looking at these, allows us to track the direction of travel for the post-secondary education sector as a whole, looking at least right now, what universities are doing and kind of how these kinds of subtle changes can kind of lead to kind of larger, hopefully structural changes at the university. They're also incredibly rich documents that allow us to analyze language usage, to identify accountability structures, to measure what kind of firm commitments are made, and really kind of look at a broader sense of where a university envisions itself going when it comes to indigenization initiatives. There are, of course, many limitations with strategic plans too, so we don't want to treat these as like documents that are, um, you know, perfect in any way. Um, but the kind of biggest limitation with strategic planning is that universities are typically not great at actually implementing strategic plans. Events and issues get in the way. They're very kind of decentralized authority structures at a lot of universities, and so kind of people do what they want to do regardless of a strategic plan. And so it's very kind of tough at a university to have a top-down strategic plan. So what's kind of committed to in a strategic plan might not always get implemented. Second, strategic plans are in their nature kind of aspirational documents. So it can feel a bit like it's a public relations exercise, and indeed it is. Um, yeah, and but it also can kind of again motivate and kind of provide hopefully resources for pursuing the goals in say an indigenization plan. There's also a lot of cynicism around strategic plans, not just amongst academics, but Indigenous people in particular. There's kind of this sense that we've heard it all before. People have been saying this for years. It's never changed anything, and so there's kind of, I think, a distrust in the strategic planning process, kind of broadly. Yeah, but having kind of been involved in these, and Rob, I know, has been involved in developing them as well. Um, they do matter. They do have an impact. They do kind of motivate people, and they do kind of lead to the creation of new things. And so they're a complex document, but they are kind of in many ways the best kind of resource we have for gauging a lot of this stuff. Yeah. So we have a broad range of experience and a knowledge of indigenization policy and practice. We all study it. Rob and I are also academic administrators, and so do a lot of this work kind of on a daily basis as well. We've worked on strategic planning in our units and at our home institutions, and we've also been doing a fair bit of training with kind of senior leaders thinking about how to implement indigenization, how to think about indigenization, and how to kind of empower kind of people at your university to pursue indigenization. A little bit about our framework before we get into our results. And so the framework that we're using was something developed by Danielle and I a few years back, which we initially called the indigenization spectrum, which you can see from the U of A strategic plan. They envision it as a series of growing circles. We've come to like that metaphor, better than spectrum, but spectrum is what we initially called it. So what we found when we interviewed people in 2017, this was published in 2018, um, was that they were using the term indigenization on campus to kind of pursue a lot of kind of very ambitious structural change. But they felt that when they talked to their senior leadership, what they were kind of hearing was people using the term indigenization to mean something very different. And so what we wanted to do is kind of provide a language to kind of unpack this a little bit. You'll see in our results too that this framework has largely held up over the past few years and still is kind of how the kind of different ways in which indigenization is pursued. Um, and so basically, we found that there are three different indigenization frameworks or visions, ways to understand indigenization. Um, and that they get used in distinct ways. So the first is Indigenous inclusion, and this is kind of the one that's largely consistent with a lot of, say, EDI plannings. And so the goal here is that it's indigenization is a policy that aims to increase the number of Indigenous students, faculty, and staff in the Canadian Academy. However, it does largely by supporting the adaptation of Indigenous people to the current and often alienating culture of the university. And so this is kind of, there are barriers in place. We recognize that, and we will help people overcome those barriers. We might not be able to remove those barriers, but we'll have some policies in place, right? So the onus is often on Indigenous people to adapt. But of course, this is also something that has been pursued widely over the last decade or so, and it has had somewhat of a transformative impact. So while we're not kind of fully discounting this, it is important. We want to kind of limit we see this as a limiting vision of what indigenization and reconciliation could be. The second is an understanding of indigenization as reconciliation or reconciliation indigenization. This is a vision that locates indigenization on common ground between Indigenous and Canadian ideals, creating a new, broader consensus on debates such as what counts as knowledge, how should Indigenous knowledges and European-derived knowledges engage with one another, and what types of relationships should academic institutions have with Indigenous communities. Finally, is decolonizing or decolonial indigenization, which is kind of the most transformative. I think this is the direction we all lean, and probably a lot of the folks at this webinar would lean in this direction, is seeing indigenization as a wholesale overhaul of the academy and fundamentally reorienting it to a different type of knowledge production based on power, change power relations, creating something dynamic and new in the place of what we have currently. We found this kind of, again, the spectrum, right? This exists on an idea where each of these, as we kind of move from Indigenous inclusion to reconciliation indigenization to decolonial indigenization, is progressively more structural in its orientation and so more transformative. Yeah. And this is something that we use in our subsequent analysis of indigenization and strategic plans at universities. So I will turn it over to Danielle, who will start going through our results.
Sure. Thanks, Adam. So just to sort of revert back a little bit, the purpose of the pilot study was for us to validate our initial round of coding and analysis before we began the larger, more comprehensive study. So in the pilot, we were looking for institutional plans, both Indigenous plans and strategic plans that were in effect as of January 1st, 2024. We selected the U15 as a pilot because of their status as research-intensive institutions. So the U15 schools are institutions that frequently or usually participate in the Canada Research Chairs program, which has an equity, diversity, and inclusion requirement. As of the 2019 competition, the institutions that host CRC chairs were required to have an EDI plan for the CRC program. And as part of the program, there's an equity target for women and gender equity seeking groups, disabled people, people of color, and Indigenous peoples. The target for Indigenous peoples is at least 4.9% of folks holding a CRC being Indigenous. And we assumed that this focus on research at the U15, in addition to the CRC EDI plans, would mean that the U15 schools would be more likely to have Indigenous strategic plans. And just a brief note, we only focused on the anglophone schools in the U15. Our current team doesn't have the linguistic competency or capacity and background knowledge to fully engage with the materials from francophone universities. Can I have the next slide, please, Adam? So from the initial scan and the pilot project, we determined that the 13 anglophone U15 schools, 2 didn't have Indigenous plans and all of them had strategic plans. The graphic on the screen lists each of the 13 U15 schools, with purple representing the Indigenous plans and the gray squares representing the strat plans. Our analysis of the U15 Indigenous and strategic plans began with 22 provisional descriptive codes that were based on our collective understanding of key ideas, concepts, and themes that come up when indigeneity is discussed in reconciliatory contexts. So the discourses that we are familiar with given our academic areas of study. These codes were divided into 2 larger thematic groupings, one that focused on Indigenous inclusion and the other on reconciliation, indigenization. We used the same codes for both the Indigenous and strategic plans. We were looking to see how and if Indigenous concerns in post-secondary landscapes were translating to the institutional plans, or if they were only being considered within the Indigenous plans. In other words, we wanted to see if Indigenous concerns were being thought about at the institutional level, or if they were considered an afterthought or not a primary concern at all. As we read through the plans, we kept a list of other phrasings that kept coming up, and we treated these as in vivo codes, of which there were 39 and 9 subcodes. Those subcodes were very important. Between the provisional codes and the in vivo codes, the U15 plans went through 2 rounds of coding. And I'm not really going to discuss the findings of the pilot because they're interconnected with the findings from our more comprehensive study. But I wanted to point out here that of the 2 institutions that did not have Indigenous strategic plans, one of them included advancing meaningful reconciliation and decolonization as an institutional strategic goal, whereas the other institution made no mention of Indigenous peoples at all in their strat plan. And I'll leave you to guess which one was which. Next slide, please, Adam. So the larger study also utilized Maclean's rankings, but here we focused on the 45 Anglophone schools that were listed as part of Maclean's 3 groupings. So there's medical doctoral, which is schools with doctoral level programs and medical schools that focus highly on research. Comprehensive, which are schools with significant research focus, as well as a wide variety of programs at the graduate level. And then there's primarily undergraduate. So schools that don't focus as much on research and mostly offer undergraduate programming. So of these 45 Anglophone schools, 24 had Indigenous plans, that's 53%, and 43 had strat plans. In coding these plans, we use the initial descriptive codes as well as the in vivo codes from the pilot, again, correlating them with Indigenous inclusion and reconciliation, indigenization, with the codes, again, being applied to both the Indigenous and strategic plans. We went through an additional round of in vivo coding and came up with another 42 codes. And what is particularly interesting here is that these additional plans allowed us to identify or re-identify codes that were present in one of the U15 plans, but had greater frequency in the larger group. So an example of this is the idea of offering alternative delivery methods, so high flex, virtual, or cohorts for classes and programs to serve Indigenous communities that are not located close to major cities. So this was something that was proposed in a few of the larger grouping of schools, but only in one of the U15 plans. So like the pilot study, we had 2 rounds of coding. The first included the 61 codes from the pilot, as well as the 42 in vivo codes. And so I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes talking about the frequency of Indigenous plans and strat plans among the medical doctoral, comprehensive, and undergrad institutions, because that is key for some of the analytical points we're going to make later in the presentation. So, yes, thanks, Adam. So the institutions that make up the medical doctoral category are very similar to the U15 schools. So there's 12 anglophone institutions in this case. All of them had strategic plans, and 83% had Indigenous plans. The graphic here follows the same design as the U15, except the Indigenous plans in this case are red circles, and the institutional plans are still the gray squares. These schools had high levels of code frequency on topics that focused on research, university governance, existing policies and reports, so like the TRC's final report or UNDRIP, and they also often acknowledged Indigenous rights and sovereignty. Next slide, please, Adam. As noted previously, the comprehensive schools are research-focused institutions that have grad programs, but for the most part don't have medical schools, and Memorial and TMU are exceptions to this, of course. So the comprehensive schools also had high numbers of institutional Indigenous plans, which was 179% respectively. And it was these comprehensive schools that necessitated the additional round of in vivo coding. So these schools were more inclined to discuss topics such as creating Indigenous specific graduation ceremonies, the need to expand or create Indigenous studies programs at undergrad or grad levels, developing systems of Indigenous grad student support, spiritual and cultural support, and acknowledging ceremonial or cultural responsibilities. In broad terms, the comprehensive schools seem to focus or be more person-focused and did not tend to focus on much or as much on policy and research, particularly the ethical research that would occur within Indigenous communities. And perhaps some of this person-focused these person-focused things were not mentioned in the medical doctoral schools with the same frequency because they already exist there. So for instance, Indigenous studies is already available at least the undergrad level in 9 of the 11 Anglophone medical doctoral schools. And then the other 2 schools already have Indigenous studies minors. So it just might not be as prominent of a thing there. So in other words, there's no need for those schools to focus on creating the programs because the programs already exist. Next slide, please, Adam. And when we get to the primarily undergraduate schools, you'll notice the quite significant shift. So not only could we not locate 2 strategic plans out of the 19 Anglophone institutions, but only 3 or 16% had an Indigenous strategic plan. So some of these institutions without Indigenous strategic plans did make mention of Indigenous peoples within their strategic plans, but generally it was quite minimal. So for instance, there would be a mention on the importance of reconciliation in broad terms, but no explanation of what was meant by reconciliation or how these schools would engage in reconciliatory processes. So much more vague in other words. And now I will hand it over to Rob.
Thanks, Danielle. And one more slide, please, Adam. So we started by grouping codes under the rubric from the indigenization spectrum from Gaudry and Lorenz. It always feels weird talking about their work with them as part of the research team. So what's offered in this table are some examples of themes that we grouped under Indigenous inclusion and their how often they occurred in both Indigenous and strategic plans. As discussed previously, these are aims or goals that intend to include Indigenous people within the university in some way, but don't actually undertake fundamental changes in the university structure. Examples of these include the creation of Indigenous specific spaces on campus, such as an Indigenous student center or Indigenous student housing, shown in row 4, showing up in 12% of the strategic plans and 21% of the Indigenous plans. By looking at the Indigenous plans in more detail, and this is something that we saw across all of the themes we identified and not just the ones displayed here, is that there's a greater frequency of these aims or objectives being noted in Indigenous plans than in strategic plans. you'll see that in the Indigenous Strategic Plan column, the frequency of the theme ranged between 41 and 83%, but in the strategic plan from 0 to 41%. So next slide, please, Adam. A particularly stark example of this divergence is in the way that recruitment and retention are created in both types of plan. And so in this case, we're speaking about retention or recruitment of faculty, of staff, and of students. Represented a priority in 30 to 42% of the strategic plans, but in a high majority of the Indigenous plans at 70 to 83%. So we gather from this that universities are quite serious then about recruiting Indigenous students, faculty, and staff, particularly through commitments or aspirations in their Indigenous plans. However, the issue shifts when we look at their commitments to retaining those students, faculty, and staff. 42% of the Indigenous plans speak about actions to retain faculty, 33% about actions to retain staff, and 67% about actions to retain students. But in the strategic plans, only 16% mentioned retaining Indigenous faculty, students, or staff at all. And so that is, we know, well, I know from the work that I do, that the work of retaining folks is actually much more difficult than recruiting folks. That the retention of staff is connected to many of the fund of staff, faculty, and students is related to the foundational changes that fall under the decolonization, indigenization from the Gaudry and Lorenz spectrum. And so we're still trying to make sense of what these numbers mean. But we've seen that we think that they become more interesting when we think about the three types of institutions, the three categories in the Maclean's groupings. And so we've mentioned that there were only 3 undergraduates, predominantly undergraduate institutions with Indigenous plans. And not all of them talked about the goal of retaining Indigenous faculty, students, and staff. Depending, and we're still working out the coding, 1 or 2 of the 3 had the goal of retention. There's one ambiguous one that we're still thinking through. In comparison, 60% of the medical doctoral schools had the goal of retaining Indigenous faculty, 30% the goal for retaining staff, and 70% for retaining students. For comprehensive schools, we see 27% emphasize retaining faculty, 37% retaining staff, and 64% retaining primarily undergraduate, or retaining students. So we think that this focus on retention provides an example of Indigenous inclusion because there's a strong desire for Indigenous people to be in existing post-secondary spaces, but there's not necessarily commitment to making a concerted effort to change the structures that these students, staff, and faculty confront, and also the reasons why they choose to leave an institution. On this point, in this area, we're not particularly surprised by this finding because we understand the goal of institutional strategic plans is setting the course for the university as a whole. But we see that the differences in how indigeneity, Indigenous identity was discussed, represented, and incorporated within institutional strategic plans, even at the level of Indigenous inclusion, demonstrate how Indigenous people are not seen as or considered to be part of the broader university community, even at what we can consider a bare minimum level. And this is demonstrated, we see this even more starkly when we look at the way that the Maclean's categories come into play. So next slide, please, Adam. So I'll shift to thinking about or sharing some of our findings about reconciliation indigenization. So here are some examples of themes that we've categorized under the heading of reconciliation indigenization, which, as Adam mentioned, is a kind of middle ground between Indigenous and Euro-Canadian, Euro-settler understandings. One example of this is a plan that states the institution's recognition that universities are representative of broader settler colonial systems of power and oppression. Taken in comparison with Indigenous inclusion, the frequency of the themes occur quite a bit less in both the Indigenous and strategic plans. We went into this thinking that there would be more prominent institutional recognition of the requirements that tenure track and tenured Indigenous faculty or the requirements that faculty have, Indigenous faculty have, that differ from their non-Indigenous colleagues. For example, the amount of time that community-focused research takes compared to other research approaches, the higher administrative and service loads required of Indigenous faculty, and the amount of side-of-desk mentoring that Indigenous scholars do for Indigenous students. And we know that because of these additional responsibilities, Indigenous faculty face difficulties when applying for tenure and promotion when they are measured solely on metrics based on traditional considerations of merit and productivity. However, even in the Indigenous plans, changing the requirements or expanding the understandings of merit for faculty tenure review was not a prominent aim. You'll see it was about 5% mentioned in 5% of the strategic plans and only a third of the Indigenous plans. In terms of the reconciliation indigenization standpoint, many of the things we identified as being part of reconciliation processes, such as encouraging language revitalization, developing Indigenous course requirements, and establishing Indigenous identity verification procedures, were not frequently included within either the institution or Indigenous plans. We think that this again demonstrates that Indigenous peoples are not seen as foundational parts of university communities. Next slide, please. So we also looked at how institutional plans used the terms reconciliation, indigenization, and decolonization. So Danielle developed a series of codes that allowed us to track the context in which these words were used. So at this moment, we're talking specifically about reconciliation processes. So engaging with the TRC's calls to action in some regard, or using the basic phrase reconciliation processes were our focus rather than a mere mention of the word reconciliation without context, right? So some institutions will say, we're committed to reconciliation, and then put a period at the end of the sentence and move on without explaining what they mean by that. So going in, we had anticipated or assumed that institutional plans would include fewer mentions of these terms, which is borne out by the three waffle charts on the bottom of the slide. When we look at when we divide it by the three types of institutions outlined by the Maclean's rankings, we see how prominent the use of these words was. So 66% of the primarily undergraduate institutions mentioned reconciliation, indigenization, and decolonization in their Indigenous plan. But keep in mind that there were only 3 undergrad institutions with Indigenous plans. So although this is mathematically a high number, it doesn't represent an absolute high number of Indigenous plans at undergraduate focused institutions. These reconciliation processes were discussed in 83% of the medical doctoral schools compared to 64% of the comprehensive schools. Indigenization was noted in 45% of the medical doctoral schools versus 71% of the comprehensive schools, and decolonization in 27% of medical doctoral plans, in contrast to 50% of the comprehensive, or plans of the comprehensive institutions. However, both in the Indigenous plans and the Strat plans, these concepts were not well defined. None of the institutional plans defined or explained their usage of the 3 terms, whereas only 3 or 25% of the Indigenous plans explained their use of decolonization, 8 or 47% defined indigenization, and 4 or 19% defined their use of reconciliation. Now, we're not saying that there is a specific definition that we are looking for institutions to use, but we think that it's going to be difficult to achieve something like indigenization without providing the parameters of what an indigenized university would consist of, right? We need to know what we're talking about before we can know whether we're able to do it or whether we've achieved it. I think I'm passing it back to Danielle for decolonization.
Correct. Thanks, Rob. Given the three-part indigenization structure we used as our theoretical framework, it would make sense that now we would be talking about how institutions are achieving or moving towards decolonial indigenization. But given how universities, through their strategic plans and Indigenous strategic plans, demonstrate reconciliation, indigenization, and Indigenous inclusion, at least so far, we don't really have anything to report here. Fundamentally, we think universities are unwilling to change their structures in the ways that Adam and I articulated in our article. And to be clear, this doesn't mean that individual or groups of Indigenous administrators, faculty, staff, or students do not want a significant restructuring of academe, but rather there is not enough momentum at the institutional level for this to happen quite yet. And I think it's back to Rob again.
Thanks, Danielle. So now we're going to talk about some of the implications that we've identified from our work. So I think is there another implication slide? So first, Indigenous plans remain predominantly aspirational in their makeup. Most of them do not provide timelines for completion, do not develop metrics to identify when objectives were met, and do not outline who was responsible for putting into action particular objectives. We know that strategic plans are created to guide institutional decision-making, and they're intended to be implemented, but without an accompanying implementation plan, their impact is going to be limited. Second, we found that the uptake in how institutions use the language of reconciliation, indigenization, decolonization was uneven. Although some plans specifically mentioned the TRC's calls to action, the specific calls relevant to post-sec institutions were not referenced in any of the Indigenous or strategic plans. In addition, residential schools were not part of the conversation about reconciliation in most of the plans, which is a really fascinating finding, which when we think that the TRC was entirely about residential schools and their continuing impact on Indigenous people, family, communities, and nations. So even though we see the inclusion of Indigenous strategic plans or the development of Indigenous strategic plans as promising and as demonstrating a move from keeping Indigenous peoples outside of the institutional structures to a more concerted effort to bring Indigenous people in, there's still a lack of accountability in these plans. As such, we're working on a new model to understand indigenization in the current moment, one that charts a movement from absence to aspiration to accountability. So we know that largely for most institutions before the release of the TRC and its calls to action, Indigenous priorities were largely absent from strategic plans and institutional priorities. For example, the last UVic plan before the TRC, 3 of the 103 goals, roughly 103 goals, referred to Indigenous people specifically. More recently, we've identified an attempt to include aspirational language to encourage institutional decision makers to pursue these goals. At the same time, very few of these plans have provided timelines and measurable goals. So while we can speak of an aspiration to achieve different relationships with Indigenous people and different institutions, it's difficult for us to think of how institutions will know they have been successful in meeting or not meeting these goals. And so we think that we should be encouraging central decision makers, that is executive leaders, to support Indigenous leaders on campus to identify benchmarks and timelines to ensure that when a strategy is developed, it can be followed through and then it can be assessed and evaluated. So in terms of the next steps, as Adam mentioned, we are in the process of writing up our results from the pilot and this expanded study analysis of the plans. What we would like to do next is to take some of our findings back to university leaders to have conversations about strategic planning processes in Canadian post-secondary institutions and to hopefully elucidate some of the decision-making processes around how those plans are created. We're envisioning speaking particularly to presidents who are generally the executive lead for the institutional plan, and then the senior Indigenous leader, whether that's a vice president Indigenous or vice provost Indigenous, but the senior Indigenous leader, whoever was the executive lead on creating the Indigenous plan. So the goal with this aspect of the project is to explore how these leaders navigate strategic planning and how they envision implementation of these goals. We're really interested in hearing about the strategic planning landscape and context at this moment, and as folks look to start renewing plans. We had to pick a date where we said this is our data set because institutions are constantly rolling out new plans and we weren't going to be able to keep doing rolling coding. So that's why we picked the date that we did. But as we mentioned at the beginning, the strategic plans are the closest thing we have to understanding what universities want to do as a whole and how they view themselves. But there's a lot of negotiation and decision making that goes into them. And so we hope to better understand the ways that these plans come into being, as well as the impact that their contents have on life at the university. So that brings us to the conclusion of the formal part of the presentation. I'll just mention we've been tracking the things in chat. Thank you for the folks who have shared citations. We appreciate that. That's definitely we did our literature review sort of the end of 2023. So as we're getting ready to publish, we're looking to find new pieces. So thank you for sharing that, and we look forward to the questions that folks have.
Well, let's just give them a round of applause for wherever you are. It was amazing, amazing findings as well, because I think the ways that institutions, universities are stuck within they're founded on colonial ideas and structures and highly resistant to change. And so yeah, so I think that your research is incredibly timely, important, and ready to move people, and really exciting for the next stage of really talking to those leaders, sharing your findings, right, to push them in their conversations. So I would like to engage more people right now in the conversation, and so I'm going to the chat is filled to just reflect back on how important this presentation was and how much it touched on a lot of questions people have, just filled with recognitions for the work you're doing. And thanks as well for bringing the presentation. So CSA, we really, really appreciate you coming here and you having us as a venue for your scholarship. So made a great contribution. You continue to do so. So I wanted to just really extend heartfelt recognition and thanks for the work.